Hey guys, how's it going? Justin here with Practically Squared. Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, what I wanted to go over with you guys is how I load my ammo for PRS matches. So PRS matches, we're generally shooting 200 to like 14-ish hundred yards, and we're generally shooting targets in that 1 MOA range out to about that 3 or so MOA range. So part of PRS is if you want to be good at it, you really got to kind of chase the matches and give yourself the opportunity to learn, which doesn't always mean winning. You're going to have a lot of failure in the sport, but that failure lends to a lot of learning experiences. Now, whenever it comes to the reloading room, I would say PRS is a sport where you definitely can't win a match in the reloading room, but you certainly could lose a match in the reloading room. You certainly could induce problems in the reloading room that are going to affect your match performance. So at the end of the day, in my opinion, with loading ammo, we're trying to load the highest quality ammo we can, but you're also trying to blend that in conjunction with loading it efficiently. So you are sacrificing a little bit of quality that maybe a bench rest guy would hold his standard to be able to load the volume that we shoot to be good at PRS. A disclaimer I want to hit you guys with before we get into the video. I'm not a pro level shooter in PRS by any means. I'm definitely aspiring to get there. This is my third full season. Shot a ton of matches along the way. The other thing I'll hit you with, if you ask 10 different guys how they load their PRS ammo, you're probably going to get 10 different processes. Most of us do similar things and similar steps and similar orders, but everybody has their own little tweak and their own little different things that they do along the way. Some guys even admit certain processes and stuff like that. So take everything in this video with a grain of salt, and without further ado, let's kind of get into it. So the first thing I do whenever I'm getting ready to load my ammo, I got to get that brass cleaned up. So the first step we're going to talk about is cleaning your brass. So this certainly isn't the sexiest process, but what I like to do is I like to use a vibratory dry tumbler. I have walnut media in here. This is the Dillon CV750. Essentially what's going to happen here, I'm going to throw my brass in here. There's walnut media in there. It's going to vibrate generally depending on how dirty the brass is. I'll let it run for like 30 minutes if it's real clean brass, or on the long end, I'll let this go for a couple hours. I don't really think with dry tumbling you could ever really go too long. I've accidentally left this on overnight and the next day the brass has been perfectly fine. That's the advantage with dry tumbling. It is dusty. Every once in a while you're going to have to throw some, what I like to do is cut up dryer sheets, throw them in there, and it's going to filter out some of that dust and debris out of your media. Also, what I like to put in my media is this new finish car wax. This is just a little bit of car wax. Basically what it does is it gives a little bit of lubricant to the media. It's real important for like virgin brass and stuff like that. It gives it a little bit of lubricity. I don't go through and I don't lube my necks or anything like that. So it does give a little lubricity to the brass, so it's not super dry and super hard. And that's something that Tom Danielson from Alpha and some of the Peterson guys as well recommended, either using like a Flitz polish or like a new finish or something like that. So it's definitely not something that's unique. A lot of guys do that, but dry tumbling my brass is personally the way to go. I also do have a wet tumbler. I wet tumbled my brass early on in my PRS career, and what I ended up with were some peen necks that ultimately cost me it caused me to go to somebody's backup rifle at a match because my ammo just wasn't fitting my chamber very well because of the peen necks. So dry tumbling is what I definitely recommend. I've definitely had bad experiences with wet tumbling. As far as dry tumbling, you're going to tumble it for a couple hours, and then if I pan over here to the side, just a media separator. You put it in there, it basically sorts out all the media, and your brass is going to come out ready to go. And then we'll move on to our next process, which for me is going to be annealing my brass. All right, so the next step in my process is going to be annealing my brass. So what I personally choose to use in Annealing Made Perfect, this is the amp. This is the older school one. The new school one has the touchscreen display on there. But this is very easy to do. There's no open flame or anything like that. It's an induction-based annealer. If you know anything about annealing, I'm sure you're familiar with an amp. There's tons of videos, tons of articles out there on the amp. It's a pretty good system. I use this to pretty much anneal all my brass, 6 Dasher, 6.5 Creed, 308, 223, pretty much all that stuff. I'm using on the amp these days. They do make an optional adapter that's like 450 bucks. It's called an amp mate. It'll essentially automate this process, and then you're going to hook up a Dillon cage feeder to it. I haven't got that yet. I've been using this for probably about a year and a half now, and it's worked pretty good. It's pretty easy to do. You'll see some B-roll here, how easy and how quickly it is to anneal. And I do anneal every single firing just because of consistency's sake. With an amp, there's really no reason to not anneal every single firing. It's just going to aid in consistency, and it's a process that's also going to prolong the life of your brass, which is why I personally choose to do it. So annealing, pretty simple, pretty easy. Let's move on to the next process of my brass, which is going to be lubing my cases. So once we get our brass cleaned and annealed, the next process is going to be to size that brass down. But before we size it, we need to lubricate those cases. Lubricating your cases, everybody does it a little bit different. This isn't a sexy part of the video, so we're just going to talk about it. But I've used for a while this Frankford Arsenal lanolin-based lube. What I've recently switched over to is the Alpha Munitions lube. It's all good stuff. I do notice the Alpha Munitions stuff. It seems to be a lot smoother on the press, but we're really kind of splitting hairs. Essentially what I'll do is I'll put my case in this old popcorn bowl, shake them in there, give it a couple sprays, shake it up, spray it again, and then let it sit for a couple minutes. And then at that point, it's ready to size my cases. So once we got our brass cleaned, annealed, and lubricated, the next thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and get that case sized down. And then I like to do a separate step, which is going to be mandreling. Now, whenever it comes to sizing, there's tons of different ways you could do it. A lot of guys will do it on single stage presses. There are a handful of guys out there that prefer to do it on progressive presses. I personally have used both. I do notice I get a little bit better consistency with my single stage press, but is it enough to cost me any sort of points or gain me any sort of points, I guess I should say? I don't really know. I've gone back and forth. It really kind of depends. I've set it up and definitely done it on both. Currently, what I'm doing is I'm sizing my brass on my coax. I will say 95% of my PRS career, my ammo has all been sized on the Dillon. What I do notice with the Dillon is you got to keep the shell plate clean, and then also I'd say 90% of my cases have 2 to 3 thou shoulder bump, but I am going to have some at the extreme ends that are going to have like 1.5 or even 4. I notice going to the single stage press, whenever I size on it, if I set it for about 2.5 thou shoulder bump, I'm going to get a tolerance of about 2 to 3. So generally my tolerance window is significantly less. In my case, with my dies, with the Forster coax over my Dillon XL750, but there's a lot of guys out there like Ryan Beck loads on a progressive press, and he came in 5th place in the PRS last year. I know a lot of other guys who have loaded on progressive presses for years, and you definitely could do it, and you definitely could win matches loading on a progressive. It all just kind of comes down to personal preference. Since I am loading currently, sizing my brass on my Forster coax, I'll go through and I'll size that. This is a Short Action Customs Alpha Dasher die that we're using here as the example today. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to size it. It's a bushing die. I have the the expander ball pulled out of it. And then once that brass is sized, I'm going to dump it in my case feeder. We're going to run it down through here, and then the tool head that I have set up just has a mandrel die on it. So essentially all I'm doing at that point is just mandreling the inside of those necks. That's essentially how I do it. Like I said, everybody's process is going to be a little bit different here, so you can figure out what works best for you, but this is just how I'm currently doing it. So a couple things I want to mention along the way. Whenever I'm going through and I'm using my Dillon to mandrel this, I will basically disable my prime system. So I'll remove the spring and I'll remove the guide rod that activates the primer system. So that way I'm not worried about trying to prime the cases or anything like that. I just keep it separated in this step. I'm going to go through and I'm going to mandrel that, and then the next process of my process is to take it back out to my dry tumbler and dry tumble it again. That's going to help get that lube off. Now, this is something where it's controversial. I know some guys out there who don't like dry tumbling to get their lube off. There's a lot of different stuff that you could do there. Personally, I just throw it back in that dry tumbler. I dry tumble it. I'll let it go for at least an hour. At this point, it'll get it a kind of a final clean state, and it's ready to go from there. After I go through and I dry tumble it, which we're going to kind of skip that step in the video purpose here, and then I'm going to get it to the point where it's going to need trimmed. So we're going to go over and we're going to show you guys how I trim, chamfer, and deburr my cases. So at this point, we're ready to trim our brass. What I like to do is do a trim, chamfer, and deburr all in one. I used to have a Gerard set up. I recently switched over to the Henderson. So far, this thing seems to be a pretty sick little system. But I have it currently set up for 6.5 Creed, so those astute viewers, we're doing different brass in this step. But yeah, the Henderson is going to give it a trim chamfer deburr. That's very important to aid in smooth seating and also smooth chambering with that chamfer and that door on the outside. So the Henderson's a really nice setup. There's a lot of good ones out there. As most of this stuff in this video is, this is a very expensive piece of reloading kit. So just know you definitely don't need this, but it is a very nice piece of kit to have, and it's going to buy you some of that time back. So once we get that brass chamfered and deburred, at that point I pretty much consider it ready for loading. At that point I'll stage my brass until I'm actually ready to load for a match. Whenever it comes time to get ready to load for a match, what I'll do is I'll take that brass and I'll go ahead and throw it into my case feeder again. And then at this point, I'll remove the tool head, I'll reactivate my priming system, and I'm ready to prime my brass. In this step, all I'm literally doing is priming brass. I use the Dillon because I have a Dillon 750. I have a case feeder. It's just as simple as pull the handle. I'll watch the primer, make sure it's picking up a primer, and then whenever it cycles back, make sure there's no primer. That ensures that I'm actually priming all my cases. And it's a way that I could efficiently and quickly go through, prime all my cases, and at that point, I'm ready to throw powder and load bullets. One little tidbit that I do want to throw in here is during this entire process, I feel like it's very important to make sure you're labeling your stuff. I like to use these gallon Ziploc bags, and what I'll do is I'll take a note card, I'll write on it, for example, this bag of brass is 6 dasher, that's 6 times fired. I cleaned it, I checked that off, I annealed it, checked that off, I sized it, checked it off, mandreled it, that's checked off, cleaned a second time, and then trimmed. And then I'll mark on here, you can see ready to load. So at that point, I know where this brass is and its steps of being worked and being ready to load again. It's really important to do that because what you'll find, and what I personally end up doing, is if you do start like loading some brass and then maybe you get tied up, maybe something happens, family life, whatever, you come back a couple of days later and you're like, wait, did I anneal this brass? Did I size this brass? How many times fired is this brass versus that brass? So it's very important. I like to keep everything in Ziploc bags, or occasionally like I'll leave it in the tumbler, and what I'll do is I'll take a piece of painter's tape and I'll jot down, or I'll take my note card and I'll just tape it to the side of my tumbler. That way I know where the brass is at in its cycle. Is it on first cleaning? Is it on second cleaning? So on and so forth. Very important to keep your brass labeled very clearly. That way whenever you come back, you know exactly where you're at. So at this point, our brass is ready to throw charges and seed our bullets. What I personally like to use here is I have an A&D FX120i. This is a scale. You'll see a lot of guys use these. I have a auto trickler. This is actually a B3, and I upgraded to the Ingenuity Precision trickler. If you're looking for a high-end trickler that's going to throw to the kernel, this is the setup to do. Unfortunately, these have been out for a couple of years, and the Auto Trickler V3 has since been discontinued. They're on the V4 now. The V3 with the Ingenuity is honestly like the perfect setup on the market right now until Ingenuity comes out with their full system. I've owned a Super Trickler. I've owned a Charge Master, a couple different Charge Masters over the years. This is by far the best setup in my personal opinion. It's going to throw to the kernel generally. Like if I'm throwing 31 grains of Varget for my dasher, it'll throw 31.98 to 31.02. So it is very consistent, plus or minus a kernel is what I shoot for. And then a little tidbit that I do want to mention here, I have the Ingenuity powder cup. It has like a spring base here. I find that that works really good because with the normal glass cup, or I've used the metal Area 419 cup, I had a lot of kernels bouncing out. And ever since I switched to this, I maybe get one kernel every 500 rounds that bounces out. That in a nutshell is my reloading process. So I guess now it's time to wrap it up, go over some loose ends, and tie this video up. So that in a nutshell is how I load my PRS ammo. The only other little last tidbit that I'll throw in here, something very important for matches, is you want to mark your brass. That way you can differentiate it from everybody else's in your squad. What I like to use, my buddy Kyle McRogan at Light Up Fiber Optics, he made me this little brass marker that essentially allows you to put two different colors. You just put a Sharpie in here and it allows you to label up your brass. Very important. I've always used the Gray Ops 3D printed one that just does the single color in the rim. The problem is, like, I did blue for a while, and then there's bound to be somebody in your squad that chooses blue Alpha Dasher as well. So going to the two colors further differentiates it. That way I don't have to worry about getting my brass mixed up with anybody else's. Hopefully the chances are a lot less, at least with the two colors. But in a nutshell, that's pretty much how I go through and load. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post them down in the comment section below. I hope this video taught you something. I hope you guys seen something cool in this video. If you guys haven't already, hit the like button, hit the subscribe if you got this far in the video. Head over to Instagram, at Practically Squared on Instagram. Give our channel a follow over there. Give our YouTube channel a follow. I make these videos purely for your entertainment and educational purposes. So if you guys like the content, give it a like. That's how I get my payment, is the likes, the subscribes, the supports from you guys is what encourages me to make more of these videos. As always, guys, remember to train hard, shoot fast, and most importantly, be safe. God bless.